First, thank you everyone for joining this session. Thank you to the presenters who worked with me and agreed to present in this session. I'm happy to be organizing this. This session is about sustainable agriculture practices and efficient ecosystem management in developing countries. So we'll get to see 4 different presentations on it today. I believe one is in Ethiopia, one is in Rwanda, one is in Indonesia, and in fact 2 are in Indonesia. So I hope you enjoy the presentations, and this, especially for people who might be on the job market soon, this is also a good networking opportunity for you guys. Without further ado, let me just say that Rania would present first, followed by Sebastain. Joko would be next, and Fatik would be presenting last. So you present for 15 minutes. I can give a heads up when you have 5 minutes left and when you have 2 minutes left. And then we'll have 5 minutes for the question and answer session. Feel free to leave any questions in the chat. If we have time, we'll definitely include them. So, Rania, I guess the floor is yours. You can share the screen and get going.
Thank you, Abubakr. All right. Can people confirm that you can see my screen and hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So, good morning. It's pretty early here in California. My name is Rania Lachhab, and today I'll be presenting a paper that has been undergoing some big structural transformation, which is why I'm presenting it here today to get your feedback on how to take it from here. So this work is called Joint Estimation of Irrigation Adoption and Crop Choice in Ethiopia. And in this paper, I try to investigate how Ethiopian smallholders make decisions about adopting irrigation and selecting crops. And to do that, I use a nationally representative data set, and I try to develop a stylized theoretical model to do that. So let me start by outlining the motivation for this research. Ethiopia's agriculture sector faces a lot of challenges due to increasing weather variability and frequent droughts, which threatens the livelihoods of millions of smallholder farmers. And food security in Ethiopia remains a persistent issue. Almost 85% of Ethiopians still rely on land-intensive subsistence agriculture, but productivity is still low and highly vulnerable to climate shocks. So in response, the Ethiopian government, since early on, has introduced some policies to encourage adaptation, such as promoting improved technologies like irrigation. The government also implemented some agricultural extension programs. However, despite these efforts, the actual irrigation adoption uptake has not been really good. It's still limited. Only about 6 to 7% of cultivated land is irrigated. And most farmers continue to depend on rain-fed cereals and other staple crops. And the main mode of irrigation is still spate irrigation, which is unpredictable because it still relies on rainfall. And it leaves farmers exposed to weather risk. So understanding how farmers make the joint decisions to both which crops to cultivate and also whether to adopt irrigation for those crops is still very important for designing policies that can effectively enhance resilience and food security in Ethiopia. At the same time, farmers must balance their subsistence needs with any opportunities for commercialization or being open to the market. And this tension between meeting the household food requirements and pursuing profits lies at the heart of smallholder decision-making in Ethiopia. So the research gap here is that we still need to understand this simultaneous decision of irrigation adoption and crop choice for specifically smallholder farmers that are facing limited market conditions and high subsistence needs. What this paper does is I try to answer a main question, what are the determinants of the joint decision-making process regarding crop choice and irrigation adoption. And specifically, I look at how does access to agricultural extension influence the simultaneous decision of crop irrigation alternatives by subsistence farmers. And also, how do subsistence needs and farmers' market orientation affect these decisions? I think this is a very policy relevant subject because there are reports from the ADF and the FAO that, and I will cite something from an ADF report, there are still discrepancies between the government's, and I mean here the Ethiopian government's, optimal projections and the actual choices of farmers, which could have significant impacts on the success of irrigation projects and food security goals. So obviously understanding how decision-making is done on the farm is important for designing agricultural policies that are effective in reaching food security goals. And in this paper, the theoretical framework is a structural choice model that explicitly accounts for household consumption needs through imposing a constraint that production must meet minimum household food requirements and not only be directed by market participation. Why this is worth sharing with you. Obviously, we can use farm household models to analyze these decisions, but in the context of the context of Ethiopia that I'm specifically looking at, there's a lack of all the necessary data to estimate a farm household model. So it's just not feasible to estimate demand and everything that comes with the household model. I believe that I contribute to the literature in multiple ways. First, I contribute to the literature of farmers' adaptation to climate change by analyzing how smallholder farmers choose crops and irrigation in response to rainfall variability and drought risk. I also contribute to the literature on crop choice and irrigation adoption. There's been many papers that look at them individually. I think the novelty is to estimate the joint decision model of both choices. And when I say novelty, of course, this has been done earlier by other papers, specifically Moreno and Sanding and Green and al. But it has been done in the context of developed countries. I also advance our understanding of the role of agricultural extension and obviously other determinants of choice in technology adoption and crop choice. And as I mentioned before, the contribution in the theoretical model is using a structural choice model instead of a household model, but also including the constraint of subsistence need on top of the profit maximization classic problem for structural choice models. Just to give you a flair of the results, I do find that the subsistence constraint is binding and that there's a strong positive effect of household consumption shares on the crop choice and irrigation decisions. I also find that agricultural extension has no statistically significant effect on irrigation adoption across crop types. So it does influence what crops to choose, but does not necessarily increase irrigation adoption. And it doesn't discourage it either. I will discuss the results later at the end. One other result is that the agricultural extension significantly encourages cash crop production, especially for things like coffee that are well established in Ethiopian agriculture, but it doesn't necessarily encourage the uptake of new crops that are not familiar to the farmers, especially fruit production. And finally, I find that market access and land tenure still significantly influence crop and irrigation choices. So from here on, I will follow a classic economics presentation. I'll go through the background. I'll present some of the theoretical model conceptual ideas, how I implement it empirically, and then discuss the results and conclusion. So here's some background on agriculture, specifically in Ethiopia. So agriculture is the backbone of Ethiopian economy. It employs 63% of the population and contributes up to 36% to the GDP. The sector is dominated by smallholders. There's a lot of fragmentation. The average landholding for Ethiopian farmer is less than 1 hectare per household. The crop production is diverse, but mainly 5 major cereals that are teff, wheat, maize, sorghum, and barley form really the core of production and food security for rural livelihoods. And despite this diversity, Ethiopian agriculture is still characterized by low yields, high vulnerability to drought and weather shocks, and limited access to modern technology and inputs. So most farming is still rain-fed, which makes the production highly sensitive to rainfall variability and climate change. Nationally, only 6% of cultivated land is irrigated. In my sample specifically, I find 7% of the land is cultivated, although again, in my sample, 62% of communities do have access to some sort of irrigation scheme. So most irrigation is spate irrigation, which relies on floodwaters, which is unpredictable, of course, and is not an effective buffer against weather risk. The majority of smallholders are subsistence oriented. They prioritize household food needs over market sales. In the sample, only 17% of households report selling any of the harvest. And the average distance to the nearest market in the sample is over 68 kilometers, which shows how farmers are a little bit market isolated. The Ethiopian government has made plans to prioritize irrigation development to mitigate food insecurity and kind of stabilize yields, but adoption remains low. And this has been attributed to technical, institutional, some social barriers. Ethiopia actually has one of the largest extension programs in Africa, but it seems that the program itself is not very effective. Some things that have been documented in the literature is that extension agents themselves lack specialized knowledge in irrigation and water management. Some of the failures are also attributed to frequent policy changes. There's a need to just increase the production of staple crops to meet basic food needs, but also we want to diversify and go towards irrigated crops. And those are kind of conflicting goals in the midterm. There's been documented that there's a mismatch between the sheer number of extension agents that are available to farmers and their capacity to actually provide meaningful support, especially for irrigated agriculture. As I said before, most irrigation schemes are small scale, they are community-based, and there are other barriers like land tenure, infrastructure in roads to access to markets, access to credits, and physical factors that hinder the adoption of irrigated crops. What this background implicates for the model is that we need to make sure that farmers balance subsistence needs with their profit maximization problem, and that crop and irrigation choices are made at the same time, and they are both shaped by the same constraints, endowment, and risk that are faced by the farmer. So let's go into the theoretical framework straight away. The way I model a farmer is that a farmer I decides at the same time in some year T which crop to grow and whether to adopt irrigation to maximize their expected utility from the profits that they get from producing a single output through a technology that is described by a production function f. Of course, f has all the nice properties. It's continuous, it's twice differentiable, it exhibits diminishing marginal productivity to variable inputs. So not in any specific order, the farmer chooses irrigation and crop. So the choice to irrigate is a variable that follows a Bernoulli distribution, and the cost that is incurred by the farmer, W is for water irrigation, is expressed using an indicator function. So it's RW if they choose to irrigate, and it's 0 if they don't. Obviously, well, not obviously, but I assume that irrigation increases crop productivity given the other inputs and given farm and farmer characteristics, but it also increases the total cost of production.
Rania, I just want to point out you have 2 minutes left.
No way. Yeah. All right, so the farmer chooses a crop too, and under the simultaneous decision assumption, they make the choice over a set of m-square mutually exclusive combinations, and they choose the combination that provides the higher utility. So this is the formalized theoretical framework. Of course, they maximize the expected utility given all the things that I mentioned before. I include in the vector of determinants of choice a lot of variables, including human capital assets, farm assets, physical land quality, and economic incentives. The empirical strategy is a nested logit model. This is a straightforward model that implements simultaneous choice with nests. The empirical strategy here, I'm not going to go through it because of time, but it just shows you how probabilities are calculated in this context. And to link the model to the data, this is where I use the data from the LCMS Living Standards Measurement Study to get all those determinants of choice that I talked about. So in the results, I get, I'm going to spare you all the results and go like immediately to the conclusion. I find that household consumption share is the strongest determinant of crop irrigation choice, and that farmers are much more likely to choose crops that directly contribute to household food needs than those that have higher market prices. I also find that irrigation adoption is still very low, and the existence of irrigation schemes in the community does not significantly increase the likelihood of choosing water-intensive crops, but it does reduce the likelihood of choosing rain-fed crops. The participation in extension specifically increases the probability of choosing cash crops, but it decreases the likelihood of choosing fruits, and it doesn't have any statistically significant effect on other crop types. I can talk offline about all the other results. But to conclude, I find that the theoretical model considers both profit maximization and subsistence needs, and this draws from the separation assumption in the farm household models. The nested logit model, which I choose here to implement the theoretical model, fits the data, but I do have some robustness checks with other types of logit models that confirm the results. I find that extension services and irrigation schemes, as they are currently implemented, are not substantially increasing irrigation adoption or shifting crop choices towards higher value or water-intensive crops. The limited effect of extension and irrigation adoption could be attributed to a lack of irrigation expertise among extension agents. This has been documented in other papers, but I have not personally investigated here. And finally, Ethiopian farmers remain primarily subsistence-oriented, so policy must account for the dominance of household food security in decision-making. I hope I didn't go over time too much. Thank you, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Rania. I particularly enjoyed a presentation that does structural estimation, which is rare to see these days. Floor is open to questions. We have 4-ish minutes for questions. I certainly have. I think the one question I had was that would things look differently if you're not looking at subsistence farmers, but rather at cash crop farmers?
Right. So I did not do separate estimations for both of them, mainly because like I said, the land holdings are very fragmented, and most farmers have, like, if you want to be very particular about it, they make multiple choices at the same time. They choose multiple crops at the same time. So there's a lot of intercropping.
Yeah.
The way I deal with it in this data set is that for a parcel, luckily the data is reported for each small field inside it. And so I make the farmer makes choice at the field level. And so it's still a one choice. We could like kind of push it a little bit by doing some sort of share, like choosing the share of, which is something I'm working on. But exactly, so that's why I didn't like separate cash crop farmers from subsistence farmers. They're almost like all the sample is mixed.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Any other questions?
I have one question, Rania. Could you clarify when you talked about irrigation access? I'm really curious what that looks like and if there's any seasonality dimension to it. So by irrigation access, do you mean access to boreholes? How was the technology to transfer water? I'm partly curious because I can imagine that there may be some spatial heterogeneity with respect to how accessible that is even within the same enumeration area or village.
No, totally. That's a really good question. The way I look at it is, like I said, the predominant type is spade irrigation. So that's surface irrigation, and it's done in a traditional way where you siphon water from kind of rivers or whatever surface water is available to you, you siphon it into. So the distance to the source is a meaningful variable. Unfortunately, the geospatial variables are not accessible for the LSMS data publicly. So there's no way to account for the distance specifically. So what I do instead is if there is some small irrigation scheme that is run by a lot of farmers to provide irrigation to the entire community, I consider that as you have access to some type of irrigation. There are communities where there's nothing run, and there are some small irrigation schemes that are run in some communities. So specifically 62% of the rural communities in the sample are managing some sort of small scale irrigation. And that's how I make the difference between having access or not access to some type of irrigation. But mostly it's spade irrigation, and it's directly siphoning water from rivers.
Great, thank you. Maybe not for this project, but at some point you might want to try to wrap your head, like it might be useful to think about some of the spatially related shocks that imposes at different types and different moments in this very heterogeneous agricultural seasons across Ethiopia, because growing seasons and wet seasons can vary a lot. It'd be hard to add here, but it may be a pathway for a future inquiry.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, let's move on to our next presenter, which is Sebastain Ante, who is a faculty member at Bryn Mawr College and will be presenting some work on cookstove adoption, improved cookstove adoption in Rwanda and its effect on forest cover. You can share your screen, maybe.
Okay. Can everyone see this presentation? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right. All right. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to this, thanks for coming. The research question here in this paper is whether improved cookstove distribution affects forest cover or forest health. This relates to a broad question or set of challenges around deforestation, which of course is both a global challenge and a challenge to individual people who rely on forests for local ecosystem services and sources of income. In the broad global discussion that we have around deforestation, most of the focus on what drives it is, of course, agricultural expansion, logging, and energy production. But within that kind of gets lost this question of whether fuelwood harvesting is a major contributor, especially in low-income countries around the world that still rely on three-stone fires to produce heat for cooking. So despite this potential point of discussion, there's lots of and sort of general
Sebastain, if you're moving your slides, we're still seeing the title slide.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry for this. Are you able to see it moving now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna keep it this way, okay? There are lots of anecdotal claims in the cookstove industry, the development sector, the popular media and academic literature that improved cookstoves can address deforestation by reducing fuelwood harvesting needs. So if you're unfamiliar with improved cookstoves, they're basically a new technology that replaces traditional cooking, which in the low-income countries around the world looks something like this, where you have fire with stones around it and a cooking vessel on top. You'll notice in this picture that a lot of the heat is escaping around the pot through the holes in between the stones. And it's not actually very efficient relative to other approaches because there's not a lot of that heat is just escaping and not being transferred to the cooking vessel. And improved cook stoves solve this by kind of constraining the fire to this kind of cylinder and then pushing the heat upwards directly into the stove or into the cooking vessel. So they're much more energy efficient and require less fuel wood. They also produce less smoke, which is what most of the research is focused on. These have been a popular thing to study within among recent development interventions, or not so recent in this case, that these have been around for a while. There's a large body of research on whether these improved cook stove affect health and time use. But there's no empirical work on whether these cook stoves have any actual effect on the forest and trees, despite a lot of these very categorical claims made in the various sectors I just mentioned. So there has been some academic work that has brought attention to the subject, although it's not empirical. It's really kind of just like theorizing about what the effects might be. So there's been discussion around scholars that have said, you know what, yes, like this is something that we can't ignore. This is probably has a big effect on deforestation. And then there are others that have said, you know what, like we just don't know that much about the supply side of fuel wood markets. Maybe the wood for this is coming from markets that with supply lines back to something like tree farms, or maybe people are just gathering fallen wood from the forest floor and they're not actually like hurting the trees, or maybe there's some sort of agroforestry source here, which would all imply that actually these cook stoves don't have that much of an effect. And you can find some people talking about this like 20 plus years ago outside of the economics literature that have taken this position. But those are quite outdated, and they're not really like they're a little outdated is what I guess I'd say at this point. So at this point, there hasn't been any quasi-experimental study of any kind of cook stove distribution program and its effects on forest cover. So this project's going to fill that gap by looking at the effects of a cook stove distribution program called Tubeho Neza in Rwanda on forest cover in that country. So Tubeho Neza, a little bit about the program is that it delivered 1.5 million stoves since 2014. And treatment occurred at the cell level. The cell in Rwanda is the second lowest administrative level. The Tubeho Neza would choose a cell and then deliver stoves to every village in that particular cell. And they had a staggered rollout across the country starting in 2014, and then again rolling it out in 2016, and then annually from 2020 to 2023. Past assessments from people that have looked at this suggest that it's been successful in terms of stove usage. Studies of the 2014 treatment group showed that around 93% of the recipients still use the stove as their primary stove. So it looks like take-up was high. The data sources that we're going to use for this come from two places. The first is is administrative data from Del Agua, which is the NGO that partnered with the Rwandan government to implement this in the country. And all they're giving us, which is obviously critical for us, is location and timing of cook stove distribution. And then we're going to pair that with data from the moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer satellite. Everyone knows this, of course, is MODIS. And this is just remote sensing data, which captures at a 250 meter resolution from 2000 to 2020, the percent of a pixel that's covered in what they classify as forest, the percent of the pixel that's classified as non-forest vegetation, so like small shrubs or grass, small trees, and the percent non-vegetation, bare ground or built environment. We're going to aggregate up to the cell level to create a cell level panel. And we're going to estimate the effect of the program in your standard multi-period difference and differences, econometric structure. So we're going to estimate this equation 1, which I'm sure is one that you're all familiar with or probably used, where Y is either the percent forest, non-forest vegetation, or bare ground in cell I at time t. Tubeoneza is a binary equal to 1 if any stoves were delivered to that cell on or before year t. We're going to include a series of controls in xit. That's just going to be the population of the cell, the precipitation of the in the cell in that year, and maximum temperature. And then we're going to have year fixed effects and cell fixed effects. And we're going to as well include provenance year linear trends. We're going to also amend this and look at an event study approach so we can evaluate whether the parallel trends assumption holds by looking at the pre-treatment effects and also see if there's any post-treatment heterogeneity and effects over time. We're very aware of advances in the econometrics literature that have shown problems associated with estimating equations 1 and 2 using ordinary least squares. So to avoid those problems, we're just going to estimate equations 1 and 2 using this estimator from this 2024 paper by Chesmartin and Dautefoy, which solves those problems and reduces the identifying assumptions back down to the standard parallel trends assumption. To give you a sense of parallel trends here, here's the main outcome variables over time for the 2014 treatment cohort. And we're going to look at the trends over time in these outcomes using the lowest smoother. And what you can see is that there is a lot of variation here over time, but that the trends really, that the treated group in 2014 and the untreated group really just follow each other pretty closely. We've done this as well for the 2016 group and the 2020 group, and this all looks the same, although I don't show them here for time's sake. But this makes us hopeful that we're going to be fairly convincing on that parallel trends is a valid assumption in our case. Okay, so here in table 1, these are the results from when we estimate equation 1. We see that there's that the program resulted in around a 2.5 percentage point increase in forest cover in treated cells, and a decline in of around 0.93 percentage points in non-forest vegetation cover, and a decline of around 1.5 percentage points in non-vegetation cover. So it looks like from this that, on a broad level, the program had positive effects on forest cover. Maybe 2.5 percentage points doesn't seem like a ton, but right before, in the years before treatment, before 2014, the average forest cover for the whole country was like around between 10 and 11%. So we're talking about like around a 20 to 25% like increase in overall forest cover compared to what was before. So besides being statistically significant, these seem pretty meaningful in a practical sense. Here's the event study using the forest cover outcome. Of course, this conforms to what we'd hope to see, pre-treatment, where the pre-treatment relationship is close to 0 with increasing positive effects year after year with this kind of like back and forth motion. Here are the other 2 outcome variables that we're using. Again, close to 0 and statistically significant effects pre-treatment generally, and then declines over time post-treatment. So following up this kind of basic approach to answering the question, we followed up with a secondary question, which is, well, maybe there's some interesting heterogeneity to look at here. Um, uh, and we thought it would be important to look at whether the effects vary by how healthy the forest was pre-treatment. The thinking here is perhaps healthier forests rebound faster than less healthy forests. They're more the larger the abundance of plants means easier regeneration. And perhaps people in the cells with healthier forests are different in how they use the forest in ways that would enhance the effectiveness of the stoves. So what we do is we look at each cell's percent forest cover in 2008 and break them into quartiles. So quartile 1 is are the cells with the least percent forest cover in 2008. Quartile 2 is the second least. Quartile 3 is the third least, and quartile 4 is like the most healthy 2008 forest, the ones with the most the strongest relative forest cover in that pre-treatment year.
So you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. So when we do that, we find some interesting results. We find that in this top panel, we see that the quartile 4 is responsible for the great bulk of the positive effects. We find the quartile 2 and quartile 3 to really be inconclusive, a little bit positive, but not statistically significant in any compelling way. And then this negative result for quartile 1, which is still something we're puzzling through why this might be the case. We find some interesting results in the first 3 quartiles in percent non-forest vegetation. It looks like things are getting greener in those quartiles as a result of the program, but it's not being read as forest cover yet by the satellite and the algorithm. And it looks like non-forest vegetation is declining in quartile 4, which we think is probably just that a lot of what was being read as non-forest vegetation is getting healthier and being converted or being read now by the algorithm as being healthy forest in that case. As you'd expect, we see negative effects across all the quartiles in percent non-vegetation. So we're doing some other work on this that I can't really get into because of the time, but we also replicate this using the normalized difference in vegetation index, which is a commonly used measure of greenness in environmental work. We look at the locations of strongest growth in this quartile 4 group. And we also consider potential simultaneity of our program with reforestation programs by the Rwandan government over this time period and consider potential bias from that. And then we have an ongoing qualitative data collection project to understand treatment selection, foraging behavior, and forest use, among other things, to try to color in a little bit about of the empirical results that we have here. Let's see. How are we doing on time?
You can use 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. Yeah. So to summarize, this is the first quasi-experimental study that we know of to examine the effects of cookstoves on forest health. Looks like to us, tubeonasa result in statistically significant increases in forest cover in treated cells. We find this interesting kind of heterogeneity in the effects by prior forest characteristics. It's unclear exactly what's driving that. We're not able to tease that out, and we're hopeful that the qualitative data collection might be able to answer some of that. And then also in the paper, it looks like most of these effects are generated by occurrences in the Western province, although I'm not able to get into that in detail here. All right, I think that gets me to the end.
Thank you for presenting this, Sebastain. The floor is open to questions for Seb or other co-authors.
Yeah, this should be easy with three co-authors all together.
I think Benjamin Harrell, who happens to be my colleague, has a question.
Actually, I have a couple. So I will just ask the one I won't want to ask most, and then if there's time, I'll ask the others. was super happy to hear that you're gonna do some follow up work on the mechanisms bit. I really think there's probably something there with air quality that or not air quality with wood markets that would be interesting to look into. So the thing that I'm thinking about is this curious result you have for the first quartile of this is the most dense forest cover, right? Am I understanding that?
Sorry, I may reorient. I organized it in a confusing way. It made sense to me, but it's just apparently probably confusing. Actually, the higher you get in quartile in my slides, the more healthy the prior forest, the forest was pre-treatment.
Right.
So quartile 1 is actually like the
The
least.
lowest. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Um, you may be wanting to be thinking about the kind of good. I'm about to get into like intermediate micro territory here. Like the kind of good that wood is in a Q1 household is different than the kind of good that wood is in a Q4 household. So maybe it's like a Giffen good, right? So you're like um you're basically lowering the marginal cost of producing food, which may end up actually causing higher food demand, which ends up increasing the demand for wood in a weird way. That might be an explanation worth looking into because I'm willing to bet that there's an inverse relationship between forest cover and like income.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. We're going to be following up on those ideas for sure.
We have time for one more question. I think Fatih has a question. You can ask the question.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. This was a very nice presentation. I have one question and one suggestion. I think I'm like still confused on like what healthy forest means. Like, is it like, I don't know if it's regeneration. I don't know if it's new forest. I don't know if it's like, and that goes into my second question. I don't know what Modis is picking up on. Is it like bare vegetation that's growing? Is it a new forest? Is it a forest that's not getting deforested or was going to be deforested? So I think like that really like helps me build the salience of this project where it's unclear what is the forest looking like. The second part is I would very cautiously go with Modis. I would actually use a bunch of remote sensing products to like triangulate the effects. I would rely more on Sentinel-2 if you have access and like, I mean, it's free access, but like if you can rely on some of vegetation coming from there, and I'm happy to suggest a few more to Abubakr like later. But the problem with Modis usually comes out is that there is type 2 error that changes with location, especially outside of the US, and it's very understudied. So I would look at a few more products as well to kind of build a better case. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that help. I'm sure we'll be following up with you on some of those ideas. None of us are remote science people at all. We're just, using what seems to make sense to us. So that's super helpful. I kind of use the word healthy forest as just like, that's kind of an imprecise way to actually say, it's just relatively, that cells with relatively more forest, so like, yeah, I'm sure like a forestry person or like a real, if you're really being precise in sort of environmental terms, like I'm not being, I'm being, I'm perhaps not being super careful. But that's kind of the idea that we're trying to get at. So it's essentially just like the cells that had relatively more forest cover in Rwanda. So they might actually not be that healthy, but they're just doing better than other forests in the country.
Okay, I guess we should move to the next presentation. Next up is Yoko Yamasaki. I hope I got your name right.
Yes.
Yoko is a PhD candidate at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. you can start now. Thank you. We can see your screen.
Thank you so much. So hello everyone, my name is Yoko Yamasaki, and today I'll be sharing this paper on how the expansion of the plantation crops affects the conflict. So first of all, civil conflict is widespread and extremely harmful to human development. Over 50% of the countries worldwide have experienced at least one episode of the civil conflict. And the study have also shown that it has a large negative impact on the economic growth, human capital, and the health outcomes. And when we look at the root causes of the conflict, according to the World Bank, 56% of the conflict are actually related to land, which increase the dispute between large plantation companies and the local communities in developing countries. So to understand what's happening on the field, I searched online, and here are what I found. So first of all, just in case, plantation crops are the crops that are mainly grown for export, and it generates significant foreign income and attract the foreign direct investments. And for the last 2 decades, there has been a surge in plantation production. For example, by 2015, plantation crops have expanded to over 300 million hectares worldwide. And here are the headlines from the major international outlets like the BBC and CNN. And what I noticed is that there has been a consistent report on the land dispute, displacement of the indigenous communities, and environmental issues caused by a plantation expansion. So in this study, my research questions are, does plantation expansion really affect the violent conflict? And if so, how persistent are these effects over time? These questions are important because we already know that plantation crops are critical income sources for many countries, but at the same time, I wonder, like, is there any hidden cost involved this rapid expansion of the plantations? And this is an important question to craft a sustainable development plan and make sure we don't unintentionally fuel a conflict. So understanding whether this trade-off exists require both fine data sets and a robust empirical approach. So next, I will walk you through the strategy I used to identify the causal effect. So in this study, I used 2 complementary strategies to identify the effect: a two-way fixed effect model and a fixed effect instrumental variable approach based on the agroclimate suitability for the palm oil and the distance from the measured port. So let me first explain the first challenge, measurement challenge. So publicly available data often lack the special detail needed to accurately detect where and when land use changes happen. So to overcome this, I use a high-resolution satellite imagery to pinpoint the year and the location where the palm oil plantation were first detected. And for the study, I look at the Indonesian palm oil industry because Indonesia is a great setting for this analysis, not only because of its rapid expansion of the plantation crops, but also due to the history of the diverse conflict, which varies both over time and across locations. So that is about the first point. And the second point is the identification challenge. Major concern is potential bias coming from the reverse causality and omitted variable bias. So to address this concern, I take 2 steps. First is the two-way fixed effect models, including subdistrict specific linear and aquatic time trends. And the second, I implement a fixed effect IV strategy, including a subdistrict and year fixed effect. So both approaches have their strength, but the key point is that they deliver a consistent result, which boosts the confidence in the findings. So that's the empirical strategy, and here is the contribution of the study. So this study provides the early evidence that the expansion of the plantation area leads to a significant increase in the violent conflict. And a previous study in this field have mainly focused on the price fluctuation of the agricultural commodities. But what I do differently here is that I shift the focus from the price fluctuation to the physical land expansion. That is the transformation of the land into agricultural plantations. And this allows me to separate the effect of the agricultural land area expansions from the effect of the commodity price fluctuations. And what I find is that the land expansion have the persistent effect on the conflict. And interestingly, I also find that the price fluctuation or price increase tend to reduce the conflict, but land transformation itself tend to intensify the conflict. And these results challenge the traditional narrative in this field that the plantation crops are uniformly good or bad. It actually depends on the channel that we are looking at. So these are the kind of like big picture of the study. And with that, now I will share some background information of the study, plantation and conflict. So first, to give you a sense of the magnitude of this rapid expansion, this figure shows the growth rate in both harvested area and the production volume over time. And as you can see, there was a drastic surge starting in early 2000, and just between 2000 and 2014, the total planted area tripled from about 3 million hectares to 9 million hectares, which gives the substantial variation across time and location, which is exactly what I use in my empirical strategy. And these maps shows how palm oil plantation expands over time across Indonesia. And what I can see is that it starts from the most suitable places like the Sumatra or Kalimantan and expand outwards to other regions. So that's about the plantation and now conflict. So this map also shows the geographical distribution of the conflict. And we can see that the conflict varies both across time and space. And the definition of the conflict in this paper is violent incidents by the organized actor against another organized actor or civilians, at least with at least one casualty. And just to give you a sense of how it looks like when I say the conflict in the study, I'm going to share the two specific cases on the field. So as I mentioned before, Indonesia has a history of the conflict, and some of the key driver of the conflict are actually land and natural resource dispute. So here are two specific examples of land and natural resource dispute, which tells us like how plantation expansion links to the conflict. So first, armed groups have targeted the plantation companies directly. So in one case, it was reported that they have extorted the money and recruiting the farmers from the plantation companies. So that's one case. And the second, plantation companies also are taking the land from the indigenous communities. And when the community leaders resist giving the land, the military threatened them and accusing them of being part of the Free Papua movement, which is armed groups in the countries, and then opposing the development to justify their use of the armed forces. So these cases tells us the conflict often centers on who owns accesses or profits from this rapid land transformation. And therefore, the plantation have become the flashpoint for the dispute. So to formally examine the link between the plantation and the conflict, I used the following data sets. For the sake of time, I will not explain the details, but the last two data sets are used to construct the instrumental variables. So the first is agroclimate suitability published by FAO, which establish estimates how suitable the land is for the palm oil cultivations. And key characteristics of these data sets is that it's purely based on agroclimate conditions, not based on the actual production or economic conditions. So those are the data sets that I used. And yes, this is a model that I used where I have the log of conflict number as a dependent variables and the palm oil plantation as a independent variables. And I include the subdistrict and a year fixed effect, as well as the linear and the quadratic time trends to control for gradual changes within each subdistrict over time, such as like political changes and economic changes. And so this specification already consider many of the possible co-founding factors, but you may still wonder, what if people move to peaceful places and expand the plantation there? It may bring the downward bias to the estimates. So to address this endogeneity concern, I use the fixed effect instrumental variable strategies by using two factors. One is agroclimate conditions for the productions and the distance from the major port. And here I categorize these continuous variables into 6 and 4 bins for this reason. So I find the heterogeneous relationship among those factors. This is a visualization of the first stage. So here I take the palm oil share over time based on these IV categories, and each graph is based on the distance from the major port, and the color represents the suitability. So the darker the color, the more suitable you are for the production. And what we can see from this figure is that you need a little distance from the major port and a high suitability to experience the rapid expansions. So that's why the second category has the most rapid expansion over time. And so based on this trend, I estimate the plantation expansions, and I use it as an instrumental variable model. So this table represents the main regression results from both the two-way fixed effect and the IV model. So the first row are the coefficients of the agricultural land expansions, our main variables. And across all specifications, the coefficients on the share of the palm oil harvested area is positive and statistically significant. So this effect is robust across different specification with and without the time trends, and using both fixed effect and IV model. So that's the one main regression results. And now move on to the second research questions, how persistent these effects are. So these effects are calculated using the lag model, taking the sum of the coefficients over time since the expansion. So this figure suggests that the impact of land expansions on the conflict is persistent over time, at least 6 or 7 years. So yes, that is that. And this is the last results, but I now expand the model by including the price movement in the second row. And as you can see, in contrast to the land expansions effect, the coefficients on the global palm oil price is negative and statistically significant across all specifications. This negative effect could be explained by opportunity cost hypothesis. So what I mean by that is when palm oil price raises, the value of the production increases as well, right? And which then translated into higher wages or more employment opportunities for the farmers. When you have the higher wages or stable jobs, you might have less motivation to engage in the conflict activities. So that's pull-out effect of the price increase. So that's one possible explanation of this negative impact. And the key takeaway is that land and the price operates through a very different mechanisms, and they affect the conflict differently. So yes, that is that. And so when we say the agricultural expansion or agricultural growth, we saw that not all agricultural expansion or growth leads to a conflict. But my finding really highlights that the agricultural expansion affects the conflict through two distinct channels: land expansions and then price increase. So this distinction is important for the policy because they need to have this distinction when assessing the impact of the agricultural development, and also when they expand the agricultural frontiers. So that's the like a quick review of the this paper. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope that's it. Yes.
Thank you, Yoko, and thank you for helping us get back on time. Questions for Yoko? I certainly have one question. I see one of your findings is that price increases in palm oil increase conflict. Something that I remember off the top of my head is this 2014 study by Dubé and Vargas. I think it's in the Review of Economic Studies. It's in Colombia, and it shows that, if I remember correctly, that they compare how coffee price increases and oil price increases affect conflict differently. And coffee price increases actually lead to less violence, because I think that increases the opportunity cost of being involved in violence. But at the same time, oil price increases actually increase violence because it's, in their case, or in their context, it's attractive to capture an oil resource and make profit off of it when oil price increases. Maybe see if those mechanisms can also be relevant here. I don't know. Could be a stupid comment, but off the top of my head, that's something that came into my mind.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question and comments. Yes, that's true. So what I do differently in this paper is that we consider the price fluctuations that they used in the study and also the land expansion itself. So the previous literature didn't really consider the land expansion for the agricultural productions. I hope that makes sense. But they focus on the price fluctuation itself. So so in this study, I control the price fluctuations and also land expansions and see if they have a different effect on the conflict. So yeah, and the main key message of this paper is that it actually depends on the mechanism that you are looking at. So that's the yeah, that's a key point. Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, any other questions for Yoko? Seeing none, let's move to our final presenter of the day.
Do we have time for one question, actually?
Sure.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, in fact, some of this work reminds me a bit of Sebastain, you've done work on land grabs, and I was wondering if you could say more about the land tenure of these expansions, whether or not, could it be that land was transferred under de jure property rights, but de facto property rights were violated, or property rights don't really matter in this context? Because to me, that seems like a really valuable dimension of your finding.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I want to do in the difference paper probably, because what I notice is that this case, right, like a plantation companies are taking the land from the indigenous communities because of the poor like law enforcement in the country. So they have a dual rule in the country. One is based on the customary law, which is unwritten rule practiced among the indigenous communities, and also they have their country law, so those two mechanisms work differently, and because of that dual rule, the conflicts are happening in the field. So yeah, certainly I need to dig deeper that land title, which is very interesting topics to explore. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.